I felt it was useful for us to remember that I think it's only in a couple of sentences, right? But Losurdo makes a very interesting comment regarding Walter Benjamin's theses on the philosophy of history, right? Which we sort of touched on in a very superficial way last time. But I think what's interesting about that text is I think from the perspective of Losurdo, and here I would invite Benjamin's scholars to defend his legacy to intervene, but I think from the perspective of Losurdo, this is a text which is basically crippling, you could say, or removing the vital possibility of an understanding of historical materialism vis-a-vis a focus on production or on seizing the means of production, right? It is that way in part because it is a theological and a messianic and philosophical, even according to a great Benjamin scholar, Michael Lowy, it's trying to fundamentally revolutionize historical materialism. One of the big consequences of this text, of course, is that Benjamin makes an argument regarding the so-called empty time of labor, and he makes an association to what he calls vulgar Marxism from the Second International period, right? So you almost see embedded in this text the very division in theory that Losurdo is tracking, I would suggest, if you reread the text. That is not to say that militant and interesting communist ideas have not been generated from Benjamin. Of course, I think that they have. I'm not making that claim. But we see this aversion to a conception of the second struggle for recognition that Althusser will say that, Sartre and even Althusser, pretty much all of Western Marxists refused, which is the second movement, which Phenon, by the way, Phenon does recognize that the second stage of the battle of recognition involves a proactive building of the productive capacities, right? So Matilda, please jump in.
Yeah, I've read a bunch of Benjamin and I'm like having a crisis over it after recent readings. And I think I just want to kind of like corroborate your statements in a way. It seems like at least by the 1930s, well, I think he had views on technology that were such that like any technology that's being built for the sake of profit or like technology that's used to create profit, like within capitalism, like a market economy, will like is kind of cursed and will create some sort of militaristic backlash, which he calls it like the technology will revolt itself and will wreak havoc on humanity. And another writing of that time period is this essay called Edward Fuchs, Collector and Historian, where he's going back to the Second International and he's critiquing some of their like cultural program, where he's very critical of like the knowledge is power motto of the Second International. And like you're saying, this view of the developing productive forces before socialism is going to somehow inherently inflict some damage on humanity.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely correct, because what we find is similar. And remember, we're keeping things at Losurdo's level of analysis here, right? We find something similar in Althusser, which is a politicization of the proletariat, but with a particular focus of a kind of philosophical radicalization of proletarian consciousness, precisely because one of the huge problems in Losurdo's diagnosis is the point that Western Marxists, I would almost say paradoxical way, lean on the working class in such a way that they end up almost like completely forfeiting the history of the radicalism and universalism of the rights of man of the French Revolution. in the name of a kind of perverted anti-liberalism. We see this also with Ernst Bloch as well, right? In the sense that for Althusser is in essence moving away from universalism and Hegel and a particular conception of the universal achievement of recognition, for which the biggest problem for Losurdo is obviously the fact that these radical egalitarian humanistic battles for mutual recognition are taking place in the colonies. So therefore, your Marxism is, unbeknownst to yourself, you could say Eurocentric, right? In that sense. But what he's saying is that the worker comes to hold almost a sort of power in Althusser's conception of proletarian subjectivity and so on, such that they would be the only agents capable of overcoming the bourgeois category of man, right? So that is a very interesting point, similar also to Walter Benjamin's criticism of progress, because one of the other huge things from that essay is, of course, communism no longer has a stake, not only in the field of production, but like in the field of social democracy, right? So the Second International erred at this level of like its own conception of how man related to time and therefore alienation, according to Benjamin. So what you have left is a Marxism without social democracy, because Benjamin's praxis would be anti-social democracy. And that's not the case for Lenin. That's not the case for Kautsky, right? Lenin considered himself a Kautskyist, radical social democracy for many years, right? With Benjamin, my sense is the praxis of Western Marxism becomes ultra leftist, and I know that's a pejorative, and I don't want to offend people, but in Losurdo's not afraid to say that, right? Losurdo even says worse. He says it's anarchism. Okay, go ahead, please, Millie.
Okay, so I think if we reframe this conversation within like relation to colonized nations developing their modes of production as a means to develop socialism, we can much easier reconcile the contradictions between like um how we feel about markets and how the actual practice of building socialism for colonized people requires a certain level of like this humanistic struggle that they talk about, but not always in manifests as an armed struggle.
No, I think you're right. But remember, he breaks it down into two sequences, right? So when Althusser abandons humanism, right, the famous anti-humanist turn, one of the things Losurdo will say is that, like it or not, the colonies are already internal to the Western, monopoly capitalist core regions, for which the Jim Crow South is the best example that he continuously shows. And that, moreover, there's a lot of references to Nietzsche and Nietzscheanism throughout this, precisely because, and I'm not saying that Althusser's anti-humanism is Nietzschean. I wouldn't make that claim. But what Losurdo is saying is going on is a fundamental ignorance regarding the battle of domination, which is much qualitatively different than impersonal domination of capital and the wage relation within the core regions, right? He's talking about the popularity, for example, of the vulgar Nietzschean conception, even after the Nazis in the American South, of this guy Lothrop Stoddard, who talks about Untermenschen, right? Where it's a kind of because you see the question, by the way, regarding humanism for Losurdo has to be understood vis-a-vis his reading of Hegel, because he thinks that Hegel breaks from what Hegel called anthropological realism in his conception of man, and that this is where we get this kind of ultra-rationalist Hegel, in which man and the project of man, this is very different, by the way, than many liberal critics of Hegel who will kind of have a circumspect conception of Hegel vis-a-vis how he talked about Africans and so on. If you read Hegel and the Freedom of Moderns, Losurdo is actually quite clear that implicit in Hegel, as well as in Kant, is a form of egalitarianism, specifically on the realist demands of freedom and egalite from the French Revolution, that are almost like concretized in their philosophy, right? And to the extent that those realist demands and universal principles that undergird Hegel and Kant and the great Hegelian tradition are compromised, Losurdo will show ultimately that this is a result of a culture of censorship within the German intelligentsia at the time. If you look at his book on Hegel, the first chapter is about censorship. As I mentioned before, his book on Kant is also about censorship, right? Censorship precisely to nominalize the radicalism of that universalism. And so this obviously makes a crescendo that I think all of us are familiar with the debate between Sartre and Phenon towards the end of the section we read, which we will talk about, because clearly Phenon is on the side of this radical humanism that Losurdo is talking about, I think. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple of things about the comments on Benjamin. So I read that at the beginning of the year for something I was writing, and 10 months later or whatever, something that really stuck with me is that his philosophy of history, when historicized against the Second International, is quite a break. And part of that is that he sees history as fundamentally kind of disruptive. And I think, and also that he has this idea of not learning lessons. He's fundamentally anti-progressive, not in the way that we kind of colloquially use it, but this notion of progress is something that he's kind of like refuting throughout the essay, insofar as he says explicitly at one point, essentially, that like we can't handle the problems of today simply by sort of accumulating lessons and moving forward through history like that. It essentially, you may be able to find things in the distant past that are more applicable today than something that happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And I read some very interesting secondary literature, which I'm not an expert in at all because I'm not particularly theologically inclined, but tying sort of fundamentally his philosophy of history to his Jewishness, and particularly its non-forward-looking character, and rather it's kind of Talmudic, backward-looking character, not in a bad way, but just I think that's very interesting because I think that in some ways what Losurdo is getting at throughout this chapter, I think some of those themes are implicitly very present in Benjamin, particularly like the anarchism, the rebellionism, because it's this sort of like disruptiveness and this writing history in the present. I think whether or not explicitly one can make those ties, I was kind of making those ties in my own head as I was moving, as Losurdo was moving on from this discussion of Benjamin to these other themes. I was sort of tracking in my head how those could play out. I don't know if that makes sense, but it was just something I was thinking about reading this section.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I totally think that Benjamin's a silent partner in the critique. You know, like every critique has a kind of unsaid author that situates the problem of Western Marxism. And I would say it's no shock, by the way, that Angelus Novus, the famous painting of the Angel of History, did you know that it switched hands between all of the members of the Frankfurt School at one time? They owned it for a brief period of time. And you know where it went after that? It went into the circle of the left Nietzscheans in France with like Georges Bataille and those guys. So it became, I think Benjamin became a prophet for Western Marxism in some sense. And I also think that we should, and I want to welcome people to push back on Losurdo in some instances. One instance where we could push back on him, of course, is his criticism of Ernst Bloch. What we find here is a frustration on behalf of Losurdo when considering Ernst Bloch. Why? because, you know, Ernst Bloch was, speaking of censorship, right? Pushed out of the Soviet philosophical community and forced to like work wage labor in Philadelphia. And he literally like worked at like a cafe, and he was one of like the great Hegel scholars in Germany. So he had an exile life. He lived in exile. And when he wrote this book called The Principle of Hope, he's re-theorizing Marxism vis-a-vis a certain optimism within the American historical liberal tradition. That's true. But what we find is an implicit argument on Losurdo's part, right? That this is a kind of Eurocentric or a limited scope of theorizing. There's no theorizing of mutual recognition. In other words, but notice, Losurdo does not quote the principle of hope, where in the principle of hope, Ernst Bloch defines Marxism as what he calls two streams, the cold stream and the warm stream. Keep in mind that the warm stream, as I see it, would be inclusive of this precise colonial battle for recognition in the grand Hegelian fashion. If you actually read the definition of the warm stream, you could accuse him almost of a liberal Weberian conception, because one of the things that he says Marxism is about overcoming the disenchantment of exploitation, right? And that the warm stream studies, what is the warm stream? The warm stream is defined as a Marxism that studies forms of human liberation from subjection. But subjection and exploitation are thought very broadly. And like Benjamin, they're thought pre-capitalist. So that's another big thing that Western Marxists innovate, which was started by Engels, but they really take it far, right? And Bloch is very big on this, which is Bloch goes back and he studies a theory of rebellion, right, in pre-capitalist feudal arrangements. This is why, like, the Thomas Munzer's peasant war is so important. By the way, Bloch in The Principle of Hope talks a lot about slave rebellions. He's re-theorizing Freud as well. He says that Freud has no conception of consciousness that would be of the future. And that's what he calls the not yet conscious. And so he thinks that revolutionaries tap into a form of consciousness that is fundamentally optimistic. And that's what propels their revolutionary fervor and makes it possible. But nowhere in that do I see a compromised militancy. Here I'm defending Bloch. And people can push back. I mean, I looked at the text that Losurdo dislikes, the one in 1961 called Natural Law and Human Dignity. And it is somewhat problematic insofar as what happened in 1961, by the way. Do people know? Very important moment in communist history. It is the moment when the Communist Congress canceled the dictatorship of the proletariat. So you could say it's the second cancellation of dictatorship of proletariat. The first one was done by who? Stalin. Let's not forget. Because I went back in Losurdo's Stalin book. Here I'm criticizing him, okay? And he doesn't really acknowledge this. But in 1936, Stalin disbanded the dictatorship of the proletariat under the proviso that it was successful, right? 1961, it's fully abandoned. But then the interesting thing, though, is that Communist Congress in 1961, you know, China broke off. They said, we're not going to participate. And then what happened just a few years later is the Cultural Revolution. But China was already isolated at that point because they had what's called the Sino-Soviet split, which a lot of like contemporary pro-Stalinist people never talk about the Sino-Soviet split. It's very important to talk about that. So you see my point is that he's making a kind of not fait accompli with liberalism, but he's trying to resurrect something revolutionary regarding it. Okay. You can read his text and judge for yourself. One thing that I think Losurdo is most sound or most correct about throughout the section that I had you read, or that we read together, is the criticism of Max Horkheimer. So the text in question here was published in 1973, and it is called The Authoritarian State. And I'll be honest, it's a problematic text. Let me just like maybe read an excerpt from this text to give you a sense of it, and you can decide for yourself. This is towards the end of the introduction of Horkheimer's Authoritarian State. He says, quote, "If there is no return to liberalism, the appropriate form of activity appears to be the extension of state capitalism. To work with it, expand it, and extend it everywhere to advanced forms appears to offer the advantage of progress and all the security of success, which one can only desire for political science. Since the proletariat has nothing to expect from the old world powers, there would appear to be no choice but an alliance with the new ones. Since the planned economy which the leaders of nations are creating is closer to socialism than liberalism is, there should be an alliance between the leader and the proletariat." So this text isn't talked about in Frankfurt School lore, I think for a reason, because a lot of it actually is a bit embarrassing. Now, there is a Frankfurt School author that my friend Assad Haider with Viewpoint Magazine likes quite a lot. His name is Hans-Jürgen Kroll, okay? And I'll link in the chat to a criticism that he wrote of the authoritarian state, where he's a little bit more sanguine about it than is Losurdo. However, just to give you a sense, we already have a premonition here of the division between Marxist-Leninists in West Germany and the so-called critical theorists upon the publication of this text. This is how it was reviewed in West German circles. People said that it, quote, promotes a false spontaneity. It, quote, only furthers petty bourgeois idealist utopianism, right? In the place of exact science, Horkheimer swaps in bourgeois cultural pessimism, right? Another reader said that Horkheimer has a skepticism towards the organizational forms of the working class, right? So all of the stereotypes, the so-called vulgar stereotypes of the Frankfurt School are on full display here, and I think somewhat for good reason. One of the problems here is that what is this text? Keep this in mind. Everybody was trying to theorize the new conjuncture of post-war monopoly capitalism. We see it from the managerial revolution of James Burnham in a highly reactionary, according to Lukács, almost like neo-American Hitlerian embrace of it. But you know where else we see a theorization of state capitalism is in the Johnson Forest tendency with C.L.R. James in their text on state capitalism, right? This text by Horkheimer, I think, is the Frankfurt School's answer to the new configuration of what would later in French theory be called neo-capitalism. And in neo-capitalism, the basic argument here, and even that phrase neo-capitalism, by the way, is used by Horkheimer, which is very interesting. But you see, the problem is that the categories of Marxism as a praxis for the independent organization of the working class are basically obliterated entirely. What instead occurs is a sense in which technical and scientific processes of instrumentalized reason and so on usurp the worker. So the worker, as Marx and Engels theorized, the worker has been fully what Horkheimer calls socialized, right? So you have this theory kind of like of real subsumption, but it's also a new theory of bureaucratic alienation, right? The problem with that is that liberalism becomes the kind of saving grace, the saving grace of like the arena where a certain Marxist radicalism can be preserved. Now I feel weird saying this because now I'm sounding like these stupid right-wing people who talk about cultural Marxism and the Frankfurt School. But I'm sorry, but this is what the text says. Go ahead, Matilda.
Yeah, I haven't read The Authoritarian State yet, and I'm excited to. It comes like right after in a collection of essays after Pollock's State Capitalism, which is, I think, like the main economic formulation of this moment. And I recommend that text. It's like very much like we're in like monopoly capitalism, and like elite cartel has taken over planning the economy instead of it being democratically planned. But like nonetheless, this like elite cartel is able to set up like this like kind of like fake market and like fake competitive environment in which everyone still continues to subsist as though capitalism's continuing. And yeah, they basically say that like whatever objective laws that were a part of the crisis of capitalism are kind of like have been done away with, and that the only real contradiction that needs to be solved is the political one, which is basically like figuring out how to like I take it as democratically planning the economy. That's how I read that text, but I really recommend it.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I mean, what's the problem for Losurdo? Let's go back to the text at hand. There's no location. Remember, it's a theory about how the Western core capitalist region is undergoing a mutation of monopoly capitalism. It's trying to theorize that particular configuration of power, but there's no mention or theorization of the colonial subjection, say, of the Jim Crow South, which for next time we will see this most glaringly with Hannah Arendt, right? So that the theory, therefore, of recognition battles or of a procedure of liberation from that form of subjection is almost like fully taken up as a new teleology, a liberal teleology of liberation, right? So that that obviously is quite problematic in my view. Please, Millie.
I'm so glad you called me because I almost lost it. Like lost what I was about to say. But to bring it back to this point we were talking about earlier is from like sanitization and like Bloch's dismissal of the colonial question and how Boplio, I think is his name. I forget his name. He's an Italian guy, talks about the two like freedoms, I guess, or liberations of humanity, right? I was talking about this in the chat earlier. It's like social economic liberation um um comes as a fundamental precursor to like civil liberation because like nobody's worried about that shit if you can't eat. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but like that's all I have to say. No.
Yeah, no, exactly. Exactly. And it's a different, and we'll see this most interestingly, Millie, when we look at the Critique of Dialectical Reason by Jean-Paul Sartre. And frankly, I mean, I don't want this to be a tit for tat. Like, here's a thinker. Do you side with the thinker against Losurdo or like? I think we should almost like my friend Gabriel Tupanamba has this idea of a low res reading. I like this concept. It's kind of like lo-fi listening to music. It's like a low res reading where you sort of take a step back from a text and not, especially I think it's important for this text to have a certain distance from it, to see the sort of broad architecture of what he's trying to make, and to try to also avoid personalizing some of these critiques. Because keep in mind also, to Losurdo's credit, what is the first thing he says when he gets into the Frankfurt School? He praises the Frankfurt School for their cultural criticism. So, Magnus.
Yeah, I had a comment. So this thing you just said about him not mentioning Jim Crow, at all. And I think we have to go back and look a little bit at the finishing part of chapter 2, where he brings up this guy, what is his name, who moved to the Soviet Union, basically, like a African American communist, who then, after the Soviet Union chose to ally with, or make the alliance of the what we now know as the Allies, and like what defined the whole era of the when Losurdo has this debate about like when did the war actually begin? Was it when France and England and the US were put on the side of the Soviet Union? And I think really the basis, what I understand, the basis of third chapter is actually building upon the conflict that he really has there at the end of chapter 2, where he really tries to put up the statement of like, can we differentiate the Western imperialist powers from fascism? And where he comes to that conclusion when the Soviet Union made that differentiating of like, what does he call it, imperialism versus like fascist something, and then it's like, okay, we can ally with these old school imperialists and we have to go together against fascism. But I think what is interesting here is actually to really try to get to this root of our own self-justification of our Western identity in our idea of liberalism, which he then portrays as, okay, actually the third world saw this step from the Soviet Union as a betrayal. And that's when that guy, he left the Soviet Union, George Padmore, yeah,
George Padmore, yeah, he's very important.
So I think that touches upon some Jim Crow issues in a sense. I don't know if my question got through how I intentioned. It's like 2 a.m. here and I'm a little bit tired, but yeah, that was just a thought I had.
I would also look really quickly at just on this point before I forget, but Langston Hughes, the African American poet, went and lived in the Soviet Union for quite some time and wrote a book called something like, I can't remember. It's something very banal. It's like I think it's like a Black American in Soviet Central Asia or something. But anyway, I would just recommend that on this very thing because it's really quite an interesting text. Sorry, Daniel.
Yeah, no, it's really good. I mean, I think part of this, if you read Losurdo's book on Bonapartism, which was recently translated, or his book on Nietzsche, one of the things we'll find is the arena of battle amongst intellectuals in Europe that he tracks from the French Revolution to the beginning of imperialism. When does imperialism really begin? It really begins after the Paris Commune, right? So from like a Marxist perspective, what's at stake here is a compromised position on behalf of the liberal philosopher in particular. Because remember, Losurdo's definition of a philosopher, remember, what's his problem? He's easier on Marcuse than he is on Adorno. Why? Because Marcuse still maintains a Hegelian fidelity to the totality. For Losurdo, I will confess you could call it a vulgar Hegelianism to some extent, but I don't even want to use that word vulgar. It is a militant Hegel, right? It's a Marxist Hegel, for which there emerges a very distinct theory of like what subjective revolution is in some sense, and where does the nominalism realism debate have its most point of tension? Its most point of tension is over the question of wage labor. Is wage labor a condition that is eligible for abolition or not? That will split the intellectual, right? And that will actually make the Marxist a minority amongst the intelligentsia, of course, right? So one of the things you could say is that why Losurdo is so upset here is because all of these Marxists have completely had an amnesia regarding the universal freedom of man. That's what revolution is about, is universal freedom of man, understood as the universal. a lot of Hegelian scholars will come back and say, oh, things are much more complex. Things are much more complex. But you know, Losurdo has that certain like militant minimalism that I admire. Go ahead, Millie. Oh no, Akshay, you had your hand up. Sorry, let's go to Akshay.
I keep putting it down because it's not even a real point. But I guess, like, yeah, I mean, what you were just saying about, I mean, it's a very like general, like, I feel like this is a problem with all of this third world approaches, but it's sort of like, so what is colonialism? You know, kind of in a, kind of more, I mean, I don't know, like it's a general kind of lack of historicity, I feel a little bit, like where there's somewhat fetishized notions of otherness. And like, I do think sort of like taking that play of recognition is almost a kind of idealist mistake, right? Because like, I don't think colonialism ultimately is about recognition as much as exploitation. But I mean, that said, I mean, I don't know, for example, like yeah. I mean, I guess what I mean to say sort of is like, there seems to be no engagement with this, the history of a state like Singapore, for example, right? Like where we see kind of Fabian socialist authoritarianism, right? Like in a quite a strong sense of the word, where it's, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I like, for example, I'm not sure, like, I feel like colonialism and the third world were like political terms that originated in the 50s and 60s. And then sort of it no longer referred to a political movement. Now it's just sort of refers to, a collection of countries. But some of those countries have quote unquote left the third world, right? Like, so it's kind of, yeah. Anyway, I'm going to stop. I don't feel like it's a very well-formed comment.
Well, I mean, I'm partial to Fanon's claim that only those who have engaged in the struggle for recognition would be worthy of recognition, like A, and then B, like to be free would be, and this is kind of a reading of Hegel, it must be said as well, would be to bind oneself to norms of one's choosing. So the recognition is not a recognition as the liberal Hegelian would understand it. I think that Losurdo's conception of recognition is very much in line with Franz Fanon, more so. And it is also understood in these stages as well. But it is also understood it is also in its own sense understood from the site of 1789. That's where he will continuously return, just as I said before, 1917 repeats 1789. At some scale, everything in between was a kind of minor expression. So it's like a maximal expression, right? But so therefore and this is actually, I mean, this is a socialist reading of Fanon, right? Which is that Fanon should be read or could be read as a kind of compromised Bolshevik. Like this is a valid reading of Fanon, I think. So I didn't follow everything you said, actually, other than, were you suggesting that Losurdo's understanding of recognition, like what was your criticism? I was unclear what your problem with it is. You don't mind.
It wasn't too coherent to begin with, but I mean, it's like, for example, when I'm like, I feel like in a sense, maybe in the 60s, at the peak of national liberation, those felt like relevant terms, but it feels a bit anachronistic to, like, I mean, by what basis do we continue to use that terminology without kind of an analysis of what is contemporary neocolonialism?
Mhm.
You know, like, I mean, is China still, I mean, is it an accurate representation of contemporary Chinese subjectivity that it's in a struggle for recognition, right? In Fanon's sense, even, like,
Yeah.
I mean, with the BJP in India, you know, there is a sense in which I think the BJP is sort of struggling for recognition from Israel, of all places. But you know, I mean, again, so
I see what you mean
also
now.
more fine-grained analysis.
So you're asking, yeah, you're asking now, is this anachronistic? Well, I don't think that it's anachronistic precisely because at the moment that he's talking about these contexts of the war in Vietnam, let's take Adorno's essay, which maybe somebody could pull it up. It's available online. The title of it is 1959, published in 1959. What does it mean to come to terms with the past? It's worth reading. This is the one where Losurdo will say that there is a latent Nietzscheanism in Adorno. In what sense? Where he's basically suggesting, so we'll go to you, Emilia and Magnus, in a moment. We're basically suggesting, right, that Adorno has adopted Nietzsche's critique of socialism, and he has made a determination regarding colonial subjection, right? Like in his contemporary 1959, as what? As of ressentiment. Now, I went back and I checked, and he doesn't use the Nietzschean neologism of ressentiment. He just uses resentment. So Losurdo's kind of reaching. He's kind of reaching, you know? You have to ask, is it true that Adorno adopts Nietzsche's criticism of socialism? I don't think that claim is true. Adorno pulls too much from Nietzsche for my comfort, of course, but I think to say that would be, that's kind of extreme. But that is what Losurdo says. You know, you can read the essay. It's written 1 year after the Maile massacre, right? And so there's this amnesia of this even when he calls it Adorno's imperialist universalism, right? And says a very interesting point regarding that famous maxim of the Frankfurt School. I think it's attributed to Adorno, that those who are not prepared to speak about capitalism must stay quiet regarding fascism. Losurdo inverts that and says the same with colonialism, right? Which makes a good deal of sense to me, right? So we should think carefully regarding how Adorno is theorizing resentment here. I want to actually spend some more time on that. Millie, go ahead.
Maybe this is like taking it too much back to the basics, but I would really benefit from like a plain explanation of what exactly makes Losurdo Hegelian.
Sure.
I actually kind of had a point just about that,
Go ahead, Magnus. Yeah.
Since that was relevant, because I feel actually the Hegelian element of Losurdo, of what I've read of him so far, is really him trying to escape, for example, these saying like, oh, like Stalinism or whatever, like these kind of like categories where actually he's just trying to prove a greater historical point, which leads back to a more phenomenological, dialectical tension of a contemporary issue that the Soviet Union was in tension with on a more grander global geopolitical scale of tension. And actually also his Stalin book, which I've read twice now, which I think is being portrayed and then making him into some Stalinist. Like, I don't think that's what he's doing. And I don't think I feel like his point of going through all these quote unquote critical what you said before, that the school of what all the right wings always call it, the cultural Marxism, like criticizing it from like a perspective of criticizing cultural Marxism, which in many ways they do it because the right wing do it because they think it's Marxism, but Losurdo does it because he actually wants to unravel it and show that what we call it's actually not real Marxism, because it's not rooted in Hegelian in a real, because in a way when we talk about the post-colonial, we talk about post-war. You mentioned, Daniel, you mentioned post-war, like, oh, we have post-45, we have post-war. Like, for the rest of the world, it wasn't post-war. The Cold War wasn't cold for Vietnam. It wasn't cold for most of the world, but we still accept these terms because that's the narrative we are served within this Western history, which leads me back again to this tension there with that Gordon Patmore guy, where like we still accept this narrative of liberalism because the victors writes history, whereas we have accepted a complete anti-dialectical approach to the root causes of fascism, which makes us completely blind to actually understand it in its grander connections to liberalism. And it just being liberalism manifested at different states of and this is where like I'm not a fan of that guy. What is that like Christian guy again?
Alexander Dugin.
Exactly, Dugin. He talks about this, like he has a very external approach to this, where he talks about, okay, we've only ever seen fascism work under this extremely hostile environment. And he says, we've also only seen communism work under an extremely hostile environment, but liberalism has been allowed to thrive in a way that it could show its positive sides. And this, I think, is an interesting approach to try and challenge our own perception in a way, and try to think out of the box a little bit, if that makes sense.
No, it does.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna stop here, but that was my
No, it's very good. I mean, I think part of Losurdo's comparative historiography, of course, is to situate thinkers in a context in which the tension of their present reveals contradictions that propel a greater understanding of the sweep of emancipation, right? What Losurdo calls the dialectic of de-emancipation and emancipation, right? So there is a certain recognition, right, on behalf of Losurdo in his reading of Hegel, that there is a kind of immanent conception of the spirit as instantiated. For example, one of his main criticisms of Adorno is that negative dialectics shuts down any dialectical movement that would be of an immanent social totality within the world. So it's a kind of like fundamentally aloof from the project of the liberation of a nation or of a given people. That you could associate with Adorno's Nietzscheanism right there, and this kind of veiled Adornian ressentiment point. Because what is Nietzsche's whole objective with ressentiment? It is to split in an imminent way a particular form of value making, right, that is leading humanity towards weakness, degeneracy, or some kind of nihilistic condition, some sense, yeah? But pay close attention to what is qualified as ressentiment, and you will see from Nietzsche that a lot is thrown into the category of ressentiment, almost in like a kind of like it's Christianity, it's Rousseauism, it's Cartesianism, it's any conception of consciousness philosophically that would be in favor of consciousness. So it's this kind of radical libertarian conception of man, which is ultimately why the heart of Nietzsche's anti-humanism, right, as well. So his criticism, I think, is definitely something shared by Adorno. In that sense, it's a kind of Hegelianism that is very much anathema to Losurdo. But what is Losurdo's Hegel? I would recommend reading Engels's book, Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, to understand it. It's a really nice book about how, because a lot of people talk about how Marx takes the mantle of Hegel or turns Hegel on his head, right? Where Hegel in the philosophy of right creates this kind of state philosophy justifying the kind of monarchical Prussianism. Marx will locate the future of philosophy in the proletariat, and that's kind of like continuing Hegel. Well, Engels basically suggests that that is actually what did happen. One of the ways to read Losurdo, is to read the post-Marxist social and cultural field of intellectual life as, and the same thing that Lukács does as well in Destruction of Reason, as a study regarding where Hegel's radicalism went. Because what you have to understand is that Hegel implants a radicalism in the vocation of the intellectual. That's the key point that Lukács wants to point out. Is that Hegel creates an intellectual who the ruling class will have to censor if they are successful. That goes back to the censorship point. Why? Precisely because Hegel gives a system for the rational. It's kind of like an epistemological Hegel, because again, and you could wage the criticism of neo-Kantianism and so on. You know, it's too epistemological, but Losurdo's huge on epistemology, and Hegel gives us like the most robust emancipatory epistemology for the achievement of the universal in one's time. So you could therefore read the real is rational as the maxim of the philosophy of right. That is where Losurdo finds something deeply emancipatory. Critics of Losurdo will say that, well, here he is supporting a Hegel that is too reliant on the state, and therefore in Losurdo's communism, we don't have the capacity to think the withering of the state. I've heard that criticism before. This weekend, I'll be doing a conference, and I'll share the link with you all if you're interested on Losurdo's Hegel. I want to develop it more. But what we do know is that there's a particular conception of dialectics which is imminent to a social totality, which is fundamentally the most progressive flank. This is a reading that he also got from Lukács's Young Hegel, right? So therefore, like Losurdo's Hegel is a very interesting phenomenon. It's yeah, those go ahead, Millie. I don't know if you have follow-up questions to that or comments.
Yeah, so my understanding of Hegel is like in contradiction, I best frame it in direct contradiction to Kant's absolute idealism. And I just was writing with some of the people I read with about this. And so we can think of Hegel having this third category of ideas that are popularly experienced like quasi-materially insofar as that we all experience them as a society, right? But they're still ideas like death. Like no one's ever fucking died, but we all know death is a thing, but still an idea to us, right? And so when I apply that to Losurdo, I don't see him sort of apologizing for idealism in this way at all. You know, like, so I would very much disagree with your point that there's any sort of Hegelian idealism in Losurdo's dialectics.
No, I'm not saying there's idealism. What I'm saying is that Losurdo's conception of materialism, first of all, Losurdo's not doing this Žižekian thing where he's saying Hegel is more radical than Marx. No. Losurdo fully acknowledges that Marx performs a materialist operation on Hegel that fundamentally transforms the image of Hegel subsequently after that. That's for sure. So there's no retroactive reading of Hegel or any silly business like that. It's a much more imminent historical conception with a different theory also of the management of contradictions. It's not therefore, like, there still is the negation of the negation, right? Which a lot of like Stalinists, for example, will remove from their reading of Hegel. Losurdo will retain it. So he does not have a Stalinist Hegel, right? He does not have a vitalist Hegel. I think his Hegel is very historicist, right? It's very much a kind of emancipatory epistemological Hegel is what I would call it, right? And yeah, there's a certain implicit radicalism that Hegel puts into the world, which he wasn't capable of fully contemplating or understanding. Like that's why Hegel, according to Engels, right? Hegel ends philosophy because Hegel basically gives philosophy as social mission for the achievement of liberation. So in some sense, everyone's always trying to catch up with Hegel's insights, right? And the reason that Marx takes Hegel farther, by the way, is because Marx situates Hegel outside of the academy. That's one of the main reasons. Marxism takes Hegel and puts it within the workers' movement. Hegel is made alive within the workers' movement. So therefore, you think of Hegel as a necessary appendage to any revolutionary movement. Like you have to have Hegel as part of that, and even of the colonial and anti-colonial movements too. Matilda.
I don't know much of Losurdo's Hegel, and I'm interested. I wanted to add that Engels in the Feuerbach essay is very keen on like seeing how Hegel took up dialectical insights from science, like and kind of emphasizes that like Kant is the first person to like kind of demonstrate that the universe was going to end, like as an astronomical insight, which is kind of, I didn't know he was a scientist like that, but like there's this emphasis on the sciences and about how those informed Hegel's dialectical philosophy. Like bringing the concepts of evolution into philosophy. And I think probably like Hegel's understanding of labor and man's self-creation is like related to this. But what one interesting intervention Lukács makes in his young Hegel is points out that Engels didn't emphasize the political, the new political like insights of the French Revolution. Like it also informed the dialectical philosophy, like, and so you have this dual revolution that's happening. Like you have the struggle for recognition, and you have like the Industrial Revolution, and it seems like at least Lukács, I mean, in the time of Lenin, is feeling like maybe there was an insight that like Lenin came to with regard to recognition and the anti-imperial struggle that like informed Lukács's reading of Hegel, and what he brought to light during the Leninist period was this political moment of recognition.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, because Losurdo speaks fondly of Lukács's text on Lenin, which I read this last summer, and I can see why he admires it, precisely because yeah, Lukács does keep open the centrality of the anti-imperialist struggle, which is why the section on Lukács is called the isolation of Lukács, because he's one of the only thinkers that does that. What Losurdo doesn't mention, of course, is all of the stuff that Lukács says regarding race and racial theory and social Darwinism in The Destruction of Reason. So when he says that Lukács neglects a mention of 1804, the Haitian slave revolt, and Toussaint L'Ouverture and all of that, well, he does mention all of that and scientific racism, that because Lukács's theory of racism, largely European, what would become scientific racism, is that its point of origin, right, is a kind of displaced from the internal struggle over the achievement of the rights of the working class. Because that's another big thing here. In Losurdo's reading of Nietzsche, right, Losurdo argues that Nietzsche creates the doctrine of perspectivism out of a thorough and systematic critique of the discourse of rights. Because Nietzsche wanted to construct a version of the human in which physiological differences, natural differences, and not social differences constitute the definition of man. So this egalitarianism, right, implicit in the radical achievements of the French Revolution, right, that actually goes back to what Losurdo finds missing in Bloch's text on natural rights, by the way. I think what he finds missing is this rationalist conception of rights, which for Losurdo is almost like a crime to say that that's liberal, because it's not really liberal. It's actually something that liberals have sort of brought in and domesticated. You know what I mean? So this is very interesting once we get next week to who? When we get to Foucault, because Foucault also, like Nietzsche, right, wants to construct a theory of liberation of humanity and so on, with a conception of man no longer as bound up with the tradition of rights. And then, of course, Losurdo will add, as also no longer bound up with colonial peoples. So he wants to make the claim that Foucault's genealogy has removed the colonial subject. Go ahead, Magnus.
I just had a quick side comment to Matilda's comment there. Just when we talk about Kant, and you said there was this, like, Kant was the first one to really look at the universe as eternal. I would just say that this has been as long as we've had written text, this has been always been a theological question. Either the universe was created and there must have a beginning and an end, or it has been eternal. And this is this conflicting debate that is very present, especially in like Islamic Middle Age philosophy, which is like between especially Al-Ghazali and Ibn Khaldun and Averroes and these Ibn Sina and stuff. I just wanted to make a comment there because I think that's a bit of a bold statement. But if we really want to look at Kant and the neo-Kantian, I think we really have to look at the subject at the center of realizing what is the world, where I feel like that is where a lot of the cultural Marxist school brings Kant more into the picture and gets away from Hegel, because they move away from observing the world from a phenomenological perspective, and instead tries to make it about the subjective impression of the world existing only through perception, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, exactly, because once Kant's like the most reactionary concept of Immanuel Kant, like in the framework of, say, like Losurdo, is the notion of the unknowability of the thing in itself, the noumenon, right? That's the source of profound reaction. Why? Because it allows precisely to not, you see, the Marxist critique, and you see this in the Soviet Union Marxists. One simple way to understand the difference between Kant and Hegel for a classical Marxist, you wouldn't hear this in university today, I don't think, is that the bourgeoisie as a class is, as a class, Kantian, in the sense that they cannot extend their conception of universalism to an imminent achieved form of universalism in the world, which would be like what Hegel does, right? They prefer to remain within the Kantian antinomies. They prefer to remain within the unknowable. They prefer to remain within the regulative ideal, not the absolute. So you see the class analysis there, which is actually quite interesting if you think about it. I know many academics today would call it vulgar or antiquated or something like that, but I actually think it's quite useful way to think about the difference between Kant and Hegel. It's why Lucien Goldman in his book on Kant was trying to say, well, actually Kant is just as radical as Hegel, but you have misread him. That's the neo-Kantian problem. You see my point? So again, it goes back to this kind of achievement of the universal as a realized social community, you know? That's what bourgeoisie does not want, right? So bourgeoisie has a particular Kant. that they appropriate. I want to invite others to jump in and speak their mind as they wish. If you haven't jumped in, feel free to do so. I also want to say one thing before we go to other points. What did people think of the criticism of Italian workerism? I'd be curious what people found about that. Like Tronti and I mean, my problem with it, by the way, was you know, he's taking in a couple of pages a criticism of Tronti, right? Which, you know, of course, is a thinker who is has written so many works and is, you know, hugely aphorismo is a huge ecosystem of Marxist thought. And he's trying to criticize it, right, from this particular angle. But I felt like it was also one of the lesser convincing lines of criticism of Losurdo. That's my own take on that. I wanted more, maybe, from that. I don't know what you thought about it, Matilda.
Yeah, I just put in a quote from the Tronti section about like, you're not going to find a pure class struggle. Quit looking for that old-fashioned primary contradiction between the mode of production, the means of exchange. And it sounds like there is like this kind of Althusser contradiction model happening, or Maoist contradiction model. But what I really wanted just to add to the prior conversation about Kant was I feel like I'm noticing this thing with like the Western Marxists, or at least like the Frankfurt School is like, I mean, the Bloch, or the early Bloch at least, and the early Benjamin are extremely influenced by Kant. Like they don't touch Hegel. They're coming out of this deep neo-Kantian tradition. And they have this like very like religious attitude towards Kant as this like prophetic author. And I think it serves a similar function to Nietzsche. Like Nietzsche's like basically saying like, don't live according to like social norms. Like any norms that are imposed upon you are like born out of ressentiment. And like, they're going to like wither you away and make you decadent. And like, if you want this like vital aspect of life and this actually true spirituality and a true community, like you need to like somehow figure out how to live outside of ressentiment. And I think Kant is basically like appropriated by them in a very similar fashion, whereas like Hegel is like, the norms we have are developed historically and were given to them and they're reasonable. But like Kant is like, basically, it seems like as he's appropriated by like Bloch or Benjamin, is like saying like something similar to Nietzsche as like, oh, like you can come to live above the norms of society. Like you will posit from yourself, you know, the moral law, and it will take a strong spiritual stamina to like attain this like position where you're not like conforming to society. But I just wanted to point out like there does seem to be this interesting like non-conformist spiritual position in Kant that seems close to Nietzsche in some way.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, Nietzsche gives birth to a type of insidious populism. If we define populism as Losurdo defines it, which is the invention of a third way solution to the diagnosis, which is Marxiological, of the class struggle. And the Marxiological diagnosis of the class struggle of capitalism will revolve around a two-class theory, ultimately, in Losurdo's vision of between bourgeoisie and proletariat. One of the things we find in Nietzsche is one of the most sophisticated philosophical attempts to obliterate the coherence of the human being thinking of themselves as a classed being, right? You almost have to give him credit for how thorough he is. And what I've tried to show and what others have tried to show is you can look at the itinerary of his concepts as all sort of emanating to and returning to an alternate theory of liberation from the socialistic, communal, or collective, or Hegelian theory of revolution. Keep in mind also that for Nietzsche, he was terrified of Hegel, precisely because this notion of the imminent realization of the absolute This is why he preferred Kant, by the way, even though we know, by the way, that Nietzsche never read the Critique of Pure Reason. He only read secondary literature on the Critique of Pure Reason. And I'm not saying that as some cheap jab against him. It's true. I just find that interesting because he's the great Nietzsche. But he preferred Kant precisely because of this class stabilizing point. The problem with Hegel for Nietzsche is the egalitarianism that's implicit in this idea of the universal as realizable to all. That's the major problem that cannot persist. If that universalism persists and it is born into the world, well, Nietzsche says that will actually just only give birth to great wars and so on and so forth, which I'm thinking here also of Adorno's essay. In some sense, it's a very anti-revolutionary position that Adorno has. So, I mean, I do think that it is that, well, let's call it like a kind of, like an implicit Nietzscheanism. Go ahead, Aaron.
It's really hard for me not to pick up on the populism stuff because my background is kind of in the populism study subfield, but I think that that'll come up more in the book, so maybe I'll put it aside. Although this Nietzsche connection is, I think, a really important part of smart critiques of left populism in particular, about ressentiment and this kind of the negatively defined sort of conceptual apparatus of populism by presenting this sort of pure people against what in left populism is the oligarchy, in what right populism is often like the elite, or various other things. But it's a negatively defined concept, and that limits it in very serious ways, and that comes from Nietzsche. But putting that aside for a quick moment, I wanted to say something about the workerism point. And it's not so much about Tronti and workerism per se, because frankly, I've read a little bit, but I haven't read enough. But it's kind of just a note on Losurdo's interpretation of it. And I think that this that section, even though what you were saying about Losurdo's critique being kind of shallow, I take your word for that. Particularly after October 7th, I found that this kind of tendency on the left really kind of popped up insofar as what Losurdo says about, like, I think there's one part where he says, what were the Chinese supposed to do while their country was being invaded? Like, continue making wage demands. There was the kind of section of particularly the Western left and the American left that essentially would say, like, Hamas is not a workers' movement, Hezbollah is not a workers' movement, blah, 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 as this kind of way of delegitimizing national struggle and these sorts of things. And whatever your kind of position on those struggles actually is, I think that it was just a very clear kind of manifestation of Losurdo's critique of Tronti, that you were seeing this sort of stuff in very explicit terms from people on the so-called left. And so that was just very striking to me, kind of, especially given that we're still in the middle of the kind of bombardment of Gaza.
It's really good, because I mean, a lot of people don't understand, but like, Italian workerism was dealing with what was so novel about Italian workerism. It was the wildcat strike. That was its site. And the wildcat strike is really important to Marxists because it indicates a break from trade union consciousness. Like, things get interesting for Marxists when the workers take on the bosses. That's when Marxism enters the room. That's when we really care, right? We don't want, we think that unionism kind of, union movement ultimately pacifies workers, that it is a kind of stage, it's right. It's a fundamental point. Well, Losurdo's criticizing Italian workerism because they're as almost like an anarchist, shallow anti-workerism, right? But what I think he's sort of neglecting is the fact that, well, that was actually born from a true experience of those workers, right? Which was a matured class struggle in some sense. So it looks very different to us now, because I think the status of the worker is what, like, what Tikkun calls, like, we no longer have workers, we have needy opportunists, where most people on earth today would actually love for exploitation to some extent. Like, I think Frederick Jameson's point about structural unemployment and shit like that is probably a sunk condition of proletarian existence, which is so different than the so-called workerist heyday. You know what I'm saying? That And that fact also changes all of these categories, like Akshay is saying about recognition and all of that, which we can talk about later. But go ahead, Ivan, please.
Good evening. Yeah, thanks for asking that question about workerism. I'm of some kind of generation that got super excited about Negri and Hart's Empire in 2000, right? It came out as like a revolutionary, just it changed everybody's life, especially mine, from pessimism to optimism. That's what happened. It's like until Empire, we were like, we're screwed, we lost, capitalists won, it's the end of history, there's nothing to do. All we have is these triple negatives from Fred Jameson, who was holding the light in a way, but like, we cannot not, we have to continue, we somehow you gotta keep going, but there's nothing, blah blah blah. And then these guys come in and say, hey, we're actually winning, you didn't realize. Now, that's turned out to be ridiculous in so many ways, but some things remain, which are that they made a serious case for updating the theory of stages or imperialism. Imperialism, Lenin's theorization of imperialism as the last stage of capitalism seems to continue on like this is all this anti-intellectualism of sorts that we find in a lot of what Losurdo would call Eastern Marxism, this kind of refusal to go on and theorize ad nauseum, and instead fight or practice or whatever, practice revolution, which I'm all the way on board with. But a part of that is this refusal to actually engage with the fact that we have to actually recognize that the world has changed since 1917, and a lot of the practical Marxists or whatever people who are engaged in the struggle and are not intellectuals at the universities don't want to do that. They're just accepting, and I think that there's a lot of evidence in Losurdo of that kind of thinking. And now I don't know if this is the same idea or related or what, but like what I'm finding is that Losurdo seems to be accusing everyone, but especially workers, Tronti here in this instance, of ignoring the colonies, right? And he says, here's a quote on page 98 where he says, this is Mario Tronti's quote: "Our workerism should be given credit for not falling into the trap of third worldism, of the countryside against the city, of the farmers' long marches. We were never Chinese." This is outrageous to Losurdo. But what's outrageous to me is that Losurdo expects somebody who's trying to carry out a revolution in northern Italy to care about farmers' marches. You know what I mean? There's no farmers in northern Italy, and that's the thing. Like what these guys are doing is trying to carry out a revolution in the West, and they're trying to they're getting excited about the workers' uprising in the West. Same with like Lenin in England and so on. He's like, so I think that there's a bit of a there's a lot of practical Marxists who are kind of missing the point on both ends. So you have Trotskyists who are saying, I don't care about Palestine getting slaughtered. That's between the Muslims and the Jewish religious fanatics. I don't care about Russia and Ukraine because that's between capital Russian imperialists and Western imperialists and so on. All I care about is the workers. So, like, I want to see workers in the factory in Ukraine and stand up together with the Russian workers and overthrow all of the all the governments everywhere, blah, 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 which also like kind of like a Trotskyist anarchist, some kind of Trotskyist anarchist position, which is ridiculous. And the Losurdo constantly attacks it, and it makes sense that he would. But I'm sensing in Losurdo a little bit of, why are you trying to organize workers in the West when there was slavery, in the West? Why are you trying to organize workers in the West when there's national liberation struggle in Palestine that's not finished? I guess my question is, I don't know if to the room is like, do you people, are you like, am I making sense here? Do you see what I'm seeing? And if so, again, back to my question from, a few weeks ago or every week is what is practical Marxist revolutionary politics for us right now here? Are we gonna, is our only job, it seems to be, Losurdo seems to be saying, is their job to continue to put on panels about the struggle of the third world? Let's have a speaker come in again every week and tell everybody who doesn't want to hear it about how, Palestinians are oppressed, or how struggling Congo, etc., etc. And is that the end of it? Or do we, in addition to that, actually need to organize workers in the West? And do we actually need to analyze political economy of the entire globe, including the part that we're in, and not just third world? Because it's not okay. Sure, let's say 20th century, the struggle, the primary contradiction was national development, of national liberation followed by national development, and maybe that extends into the present. But it's not the only contradiction, and it sure as hell is not the primary contradiction in Canada today. I don't think so. I mean, or maybe sure as hell is too hard of a harsh word. We have the indigenous people being here, exterminated continuously. We have Quebec national problem, etc., multiculturalism, and so on. But ultimately, there's no way you can analyze current Canadian society as needing development, of the forces of production. Like, we are way beyond that. And this is what this whole book is about. That's what Vietnam's about. That's what China's about. That's etc., etc., etc. Canada, we don't need to take the state on behalf of the oppressed nations and develop the forces of production, right? And means of production. That's not the agenda. That shouldn't be. That's ridiculous. I think Losurdo, if pressed, would also admit that. So anyway, please, sorry for going on for so long.
I really appreciate it, Ivan. I could say my own piece, but I want to invite folks that have their hands up. Let's go to Magnus and then Brendan. But thank you for that, Ivan. That was very useful.
Yes, thank you, Ivan. This I also found it really touching, a lot of the tension that's in the text, and regarding your question before, Daniel, about Losurdo's critique there of the Italian school, which is like the beginning of the third chapter here, which again I would read in a context of the ending of chapter 2, where I feel like, really, if we also look at how the US was really involved in destroying the communist movement in Italy after World War II, and a lot of this historical context where he starts from this, what are their names, like Bobbio and Volpe and Togliatti, or how was and these people, how they started out by really criticizing a lot of the imperialist tendencies and colonialism and all the brutal stuff that we all know about, of course, and then shows how this was also slowly turned into a much more cultural approach, which then leads to the whole critique of what we see in chapter 2 through all the Frankfurter School and all the stuff that we know so well. But I really feel what Losurdo's point, which I also feel Ivan was kind of poking at here, is really Losurdo's point is trying to show us how, and I even think from his perspective, he is Italian, so he picks at the Italian communist movement. I feel like there could be a similar story told from communist organizers from all over Europe, from small communes all over the US. Wherever we want to look at it, we could find similar people to Togliatti, Volpe, and Bobbio, who all were demolished through the McCarthyite era and all this stuff, who were actually not so much caring about their own name and their academic career, but more tried to really do this movement of actually bringing some kind of grander and real enlightenment into a populace of political organization, and really bringing this into, and I feel like this is the Hegelian method of Losurdo that is really being shown through this chapter, how he goes through in a way of how Hegel goes back and like, okay, this is how spirit has been distorted through history, and this is then Losurdo's method of showing, okay, this is how class struggle has been distorted from its original, if that makes sense. I don't want to talk too much because a lot of new people have their hand up who haven't spoken yet. So
yeah, no, I mean, I think that's very helpful. I mean, Ivan's point is well taken, because we also have to contend with the social chauvinism of a kind of parochial workerism, which would be anti-internationalist. But we also have to contend with the liberal definition of oppressed people, which is still in academia today, which I would suggest that what Losurdo is wanting to put emphasis on is a kind of a realist relationship to projects of state socialism existing today, Venezuela, Cuba, China, for example, to perceive those not through the messianic lens of, say, Benjamin, right? Which would imminently cast some kind of highly skeptical judgment on them, but would also be capable of seeing them as something that we can link up with in the core regions, right? Around building something which would also work carefully to avoid the reproduction of Second International social chauvinism and so on, which I myself as a socialist have seen the chauvinism of workerist ideology. It's a real problem. And Ivan, as to the question of whether the working class in Canada should seize the means of production, man, I think they obviously should. That's a whole other debate. Go ahead, Brendan.
Hi, thanks. And yeah, thanks. I'm also wanting to respond to Ivan here, because I think you are making sense here, and your contribution reminds me a lot of kind of the question that we left off on last week, which is how can we be Eastern Marxists in the West? Like, what does that mean concretely? And I think that Losurdo, the answer that I see him giving, and I think he gives this maybe towards the end of the book, I think he might have touched on it here already, but is one of the main ways is to become reacquainted with the world anti-colonial revolution, and to understand, I think it relates to your point, Daniel, to have this realistic understanding of socialist state building projects. And so it's, I see what you mean, and I struggle with this question too about like, how do we make peasant struggles in Vietnam or China relevant to wage workers in the West? Like, it feels like it's worlds apart, but I think that is one of the main challenges for communists in the West today, is to engage in that kind. I think that's a basic internationalist duty, is to remain reacquainted with to be acquainted and knowledgeable about the world anti-colonial revolution, to understand, like, and to do this though not from like a moralizing tendency that says like you should care about these other people here out of altruism, but the challenge, I think, for communists is to engage in the struggles that are relevant to our own national contexts, but be able to link that concretely to the struggles going on elsewhere. And I think the work of people like Utsa and Prabhat Patnaik in India are really helpful for this, for the ways that they illustrate that imperialism is not something that like Western states choose to do. It's not just a result of like moralist or a sort of attitudes of superiority. Those exist, but the political economic base of imperialism comes down to the basic fact that in order for Western economies to function in the way they do, they require resources that they themselves cannot produce. They need these resources on tap that can only be produced reliably across the global south. It's a matter of like, without having these things, the political economies of the Western countries would completely crumble. Like, it's sort of just like thinking about how, like, if the basis of the wealth in the core is a result of the underdevelopment of the periphery, then if that underdevelopment in the periphery is being undermined, then that's going to have serious implications for workers in the West, right? Like, if peoples across the world, if nations across the world throwing off the shackles of imperialism and engaging in projects of sovereign development, if that's taking place, then that's going to completely undermine the completely unsustainable basis of development in the West, which has been imperialism. And I think Losurdo's like one of the most helpful contributions, I think, for me in this book is to illustrate that, like, contra the I think the more mainstream critical academic sort of discourses around decolonization, which sort of just talk about how so I think downplay the importance of decolonization in the 20th century and sort of really emphasize the kind of the continued power of American imperialism, and how really in a few words that decolonization didn't make that much of a difference. I think it made a very, very profound difference. And we, if we look at 1924 and the amount of the world that was colonized by European powers compared to today in 2024, it's a profound difference. And this is to illustrate that, like, this is the course of history, is that Western imperialism is being undermined. It's increasingly threatened, and it's increasingly desperate and dangerous in that context. And that is very relevant to the workers' movement. Like, the weakening of Western imperialism is very relevant to the workers' movement and living conditions in the West. And so it's important that the workers' movement, a politically conscious workers' movement, understand these connections and understand what the implications are of Western imperialism being undermined. The last thing I would say is, like, I think we got even a little hint of that with the surge in energy prices following the beginning of the Russian war and of the Russian intervention in the war in Ukraine, right? That was you started to see this really undermined, especially European economies, in the period since, we've seen an intensification of workers' struggles, at least in certain moments in different European countries. So it's to illustrate that the end of imperialism, or the decline of imperialism, has serious implications for the workers' movement here. And it's the job of communists to make that clear. So that's kind of how I read. That's what I think Losurdo is saying. I don't think he's saying that we need to look at what they're doing in Vietnam and just adopt it uncritically here, but we need to look at how what is going on in countries like Vietnam or China and understand how it's going to affect the political economic arrangements we have here.
Yeah, but also this Hegelian, just to get philosophical for a quick moment, like, where is the Hegelian emphasis on the totality? And what are you doing as a Marxist if you are, like, exclusively workerist? You're not actually promoting emancipation for workers. It's something different. You know what I mean? Something compromised. It's nominalizing. It's nominalizing emancipation, right? So in that Marxist sense, I think Losurdo would say that it's a philosophical task to be radically emancipatory and therefore radically internationalist. To see those interconnections is the task of the development of working class consciousness. That's also what Lenin said too. Akshay, go ahead.
I don't know. I mean, I guess I'll start off by saying, I mean, I am a bit of a tanky myself. I have, like, critical support for socialist states. So it's not like but I mean, my degree of sort of problems here with Losurdo, it's sort of like, I guess, the degree of how critical is our support. And it's sort of like, I mean, I think I agree with the idea of the split, like this kind of, like, he correctly diagnoses, say, this, like, workerist, third worldist split, right? But I think or Eastern and Western, or but I mean, it's strange because, like, I feel like state socialism, when it actually existed, I guess in terms of the USSR, it was, like, simultaneously a beacon of hope. But like, most communist countries would also be sort of fighting against control by the USSR, right? Like in Yugoslavia, or for example, for example, like communist parties in India have various problems with kind of Stalinist oversight in terms of the Stalinists in India and the Stalinists from the USSR, and how they sort of relate to sort of various. So I mean, and I feel like some of Losurdo's kind of turn towards, oh, we can go to the state. I'm a bit suspicious of it because of this tone of hope, that, oh, there is something that's sort of there to turn towards. I mean, I do think like national liberation was important. On the other hand, like, you have Kwame Nkrumah in like 1963 or 1965, like going like, oh, we got national liberation, but now we still inherited the colonial state, and we inherited the functions of the colonial state, and we're inscribed in a set of relations we call neocolonialism, right? Like, and I think, I mean, it's precisely that sort of the ambiguity of, yes, we have captured the state, but we're also now tasked with exploiting our people, right? Like, and even if we don't want to, even if we are socialists, right? Like, we nonetheless kind of inherit this kind of function. I mean, what I mean to say with all of this rambling comments was, I was struck a lot by what Ivan was saying, and I think it goes a bit deeper than that, right? I think like what Losurdo doesn't engage with is that, say, the Leninist proposal, which was sort of vanguard party seizes the state. I'm not sure how realistic that is in either the East or the West, right? Like, and kind of like what the track record of this proposal is. And so, I mean, more than just internationalism, right? Like, it's sort of, what would the units of analysis of a solidarity that would be more real, like a new internationalism today, like along the lines of, say, Lenin's split from the second, like, which was a split formed on, a new methodology, a new tactic that's sort of proposed in some sense. So, I mean, I don't know. In that sense, I think it, yeah. I mean, I'm skeptical of Losurdo's position where he sort of just ends up in this third worldist camp without resolving the kind of like split that he kind of sets out. I feel like he just sort of picks a side. I'm not sure. I don't know.
Yeah, this is good. I feel like, yeah, you're raising a lot of very interesting questions. And you're making me think of Kojin Karatani's communist project called Associationism, which was meant to collapse the division strategically between anarchism and communism. I get it. I get a lot of that from what you're saying, and it's very interesting. Let's hear from Jaira, please.
I wanted to draw some more parallels into the contemporary moment, because I think there's a couple of really interesting things happening. The longshoremen just established a essentially nationwide strike. And, there was a lot of energy this morning about it. And then more media started coming out that they explicitly stated they will not stop their operations to Israel. So they're going to continue transporting bombs. And the dialogue is already starting to come up again in terms of like, how do we address these trade unions, and the fact that, I mean, and we've even seen it throughout the election cycle as unions have been taking a position that there's been a desire to see some of the stronger voices come out, or there's really been a hunger for a clear established foreign policy position. And also, as the bombing began in Lebanon, there started to strike up a dialogue also about the precarious condition of African migrants working in Lebanon who, for various different reasons, were losing access to kind of the state's administrative capacity to support them in either evacuating or in just moving freely. And it restarted this dialogue again about how are Marxists rejecting centralizing the Black struggle, the global anti-Black struggle, and can we really trust a class analysis to deliver the results that we want to see when it comes to really addressing the unique ways in which like Black people are subjected to different forms of state violence, which then also, just going even back to Italy, we're talking about the migration crisis, right? We're seeing the way that the state violence now is extending far. I mean, it's a literal transnational, several transnational agreements and agendas to assure that migration is stymied. And now the migrant subject is like a very I mean, it needs to start being really worked into a contemporary Marxist analysis, because it's like, I mean, literally the only time, even today, I was just reading an article in the Boston Globe about how Haitian migrants have now filled in, I think it was like work staffing shortages that have existed for 10 years. And that framing is obviously the one we rely on the most, that the migrant deserves our sympathy and our open doors on the premise that they are really supporting our labor force, and that trope just like never ends. But we're really seeing, or even what's happening at Cornell, right? A migrant student now is essentially being deported for their Palestinian solidarity activism. And I'm also recognizing that there hasn't been it's really difficult to influence foreign policy as like an individual. And really what's been kind of moving these machines around foreign policy for so long have been capital, right? It has been international business. It hasn't been diplomacy. Diplomacy is like, I mean, whatever, I'm not going to get into that, but it's really, I feel like these issues are certainly, I'm reading it and I'm like, this is all conversations I've had within the past week with people in real time about these kinds of conflicts and the real inability to kind of trust one another on the front of like, what are we establishing as a collective and who is a part of this collective? And if it is easier to just be able to, you know, have the workerism mindset as a way to just engender people to have the avenue to develop themselves, that's been the most consistent, you know, mechanism. But I'm seeing more and more that as individuals and even as organizations, we're really struggling to contend with how to establish a line, how to articulate that, and how to actualize it in real time, particularly because, you know, our government is just extremely obstinate and extremely not responsive at all to the will of the people.
Yeah.
So it's, yeah, I just thought as everybody was talking, it's just all of these fundamental things that have been happening have all been coming up, because I think we really do undermine the extent to which like the state's administrative capacity is reshaping people's various different forms of just who is involved really in making up this kind of working class majority or the global south, however you want to frame it.
No, that's really good. I mean, I would say a few things. I think it's class struggles plural in Losurdo's framework, which I think is very sound. And part of that means that what of the tragedies of social chauvinism within any working class movement is that it ends up what you might call projecting the authority of the bourgeois position over the worker, in the sense that like if the worker is forced into a contract or sort of agreement in which they are ignoring the righteousness of a colonial struggle far away, but that is interlinked with their struggle, that's something that is coming from a subordinated or from a position of domination onto the worker. So I read Losurdo not as saying that he's anti-working class organizing. No, of course he is. What he's opposed to is the intellectual making an arbitrary intervention into compartmentalizing forms of emancipation. It's arbitrary, ultimately. In fact, Marxism is about linking up international solidarity with that heterogeneous field of emancipations, plural. Why do we focus on the working class? We only focus on the working class based on a strategic outcome of our understanding of the origin of surplus value and how it is created. It's not because the working class is endowed with any special features. If anything, no, it's not like that, you know? I think the problem is more strategic. It's racism would push Marxism away from its strategic goals, right? Do you know what I mean? And it would also tell it would say that the exploitation of the worker in the core region has no relationality to other sites of emancipation, when I would contend that it does. I would contend that contemporary capitalism, actually, in my experience of it, still retains what we call the old immiseration thesis in the core regions, which means that at a subjective level, the proletariat is yearning for solidarity with other forms of emancipation. If that is foreclosed to them, that's an authoritative foreclosure from on high, from the bosses, from management, from the intellectual. Go ahead, Connor.
Yeah, that was really good, Daniel. You kind of hit on a lot of the points I was going to make. So I was kind of, I guess, to just bounce off of Daniel, Ivan, and Brendan. Really, what I think we're talking about is Brendan mentioned it, and Daniel was just talking about it. It's a question of how it is that we link up these practices, whether they occur in, I don't know, in China or Detroit. And I guess that's kind of my beef with the Losurdo. Like, on a fundamental level, it's kind of just taken as a given that, you know, people in Detroit can take up the practices of people in, I don't know, again, China, and just, you know, install those practices. That is not clear at all, at all, which is to then say that this ultimately becomes a question of the totality, because it's for that reason that we do not have an understanding of the totality that these things are not clear. And
yeah, but you know, the funny thing about that, Connor, is that it was only the success of 1917 that convinced the international working class. Like, go back and read Second International American Bolsheviks. Do you know what I'm saying? Read their jubilation about 1917, right? It has what you call a transitive effect, right? Emancipation has transitive effects. Alain Badiou is huge on this. It's what is called invariance, the theory of invariance, right? A side of emancipation has transitive effects on other exploited subjects who don't even understand their own subjection. Yeah, and then here you need the Frankfurt School to unravel the complexity of alienation and so on, for which they're very good about, right? But yeah, I think the point is we never want to foreclose like the possible sharing of solidarity of sites of exploitation.
not at all. You know,
Yeah.
like I'm saying that you know, of course, I'm reminded of the classic Fred Jameson lecture on cognitive mapping, right? I think that touches on exactly this problem, because if you remember, there's this electric moment when he talks about what he calls the most exciting moment in that memorable decade, the 60s. I think it was the Black Revolutionary Workers Party in Detroit, that basically achieved political control over that city, an incredible achievement. And so I think they actually went to Italy because people in Italy were inspired by what they were doing there. And what Jameson, the long and short of it, shows is that their model of political activity in Detroit could not be reappropriated in Italy. And at the same time, there was a film being made of the Black revolutionary people in Detroit, which is to say that their political model was being abstracted and disseminated on a larger scale as well. So what's going on here is this question of, again, scale. You know, how do we model our political activity on the level of a city, in a village, on the national level, and then on the international level? These are all different sorts of questions that nonetheless all hang under the banner of totality, right? It's such a great lecture, again, because that entire conference lecture is about, you know, people are post-Marxists, they're post-Nietzscheans, this, that, and the other. And what he basically says is that these are all one form or the other of a capitulation of not being able to think of the totality, which is to say various forms of local politics, right? And if you're operating on that level, you can do that, but you're not a Marxist. You're not a socialist. And again, this is it's really important because Jameson says, I don't have the answers. I can't think of totality. And then we get to people like Adorno, right? Because like earlier we mentioned this sort of like fragmented sort of thing in these negative dialectics, but fragmented implies being severed off from something that was once unified, right? Put it another way, we can only cognize our political situation as a sort of fractured totality, right? But if we can do that, now we're thinking abstractly. Now we can make or gesture towards more concrete sorts of relationships, right? So these are very hard, abstract problems that Losurdo, I'm sorry, I'm just not seeing this sort of like intellectual rigor to explain how we can appropriate these practices, right? Is this making sense? I feel like I'm...
Yeah. Oh, well, no, I mean, it doesn't make sense, but that's not, I mean, he's making a historical comparative critique as he does. He's not generating theses of theory in the precise mode that you're looking for, which is fair. I think there's a few other texts we can reference, like the Class Struggles book, where he does that. Like I mentioned in the first session, I would recommend that perhaps a bit more in terms of the systematic exposition,
Yeah, but
yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm talking way too long, but just this
Please.
sort of, just a speculative moment, like, of course, all this stuff is super duper important, right? You're talking about this sort of transitory moment, for example, post 1917. And of course, I'm always thinking about how there's no party anymore, right? There's no workers' party anymore. Maybe we can think of the spirit of internationalism and anti-colonialism as kind of substituting for this role that the party would otherwise be fulfilling, which is simply to stoke enthusiasm internationally amongst workers, right?
Yeah.
So I kind of just I just like
it also makes me realize that people criticize Marxism for focusing too much on the working class and the working class's consciousness, when I actually think half of Marxism, as it pertains to class consciousness, focusing on bourgeois consciousness, for God's sake. Giving people the literacy and the equipment to detect forms of complicity with bourgeois modes of thinking, I would say is equivalent in terms of priority of Marxist engagement, in my opinion. But anyways, I love how we're all here, we're not watching the stupid debate. That shows your priorities. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, I just wanted to honestly pick up on what many people have said. So, but I want to kind of do it in a way of talking about kind of just my particular way of reading Losurdo, which is my own way. And so I think it gets at some of these questions about, like, is Losurdo giving us a strategic guide? And I think it also gets at some of these questions that Jaira has raised and that Ivan was raising. And for me, the multiple books that I've read from Losurdo and how I am interpreting his critique of Western Marxism is that this is fundamentally a kind of demystifying project on Losurdo's. Like, that's what Losurdo is offering us. And he begins the section that we read for today, right, talking about Bobbio, talking about the kind of Italian debate, and what he's really critiquing there is the things that Western Marxists, as he's calling them, take for granted. So he's saying that they take liberalism for granted, and they take a very particular kind of liberalism for granted. And this is what he's talking about when he's talking about formal equality. That's what that whole section is about. And then he comes back to it at the end. This is his critique of Bloch and natural law and these sorts of things. And that is really important for Losurdo. And I think that when Jaira talks about a very practical example about, say, a migrant student that is being deported for their kind of political activism, this is what Losurdo would call a clause of exclusion that liberalism has. Historically, this clause of exclusion has been extended to Black people in the form of slavery. It's been extended to poor people when John Stuart Mill, for instance, or de Tocqueville, or these people talk about childlike multitudes. These are ways of excluding people from the liberal consciousness, the liberal subject. And it goes back to actually what Daniel was saying earlier, which is this process of disemancipation and emancipation. This comes out in the Bonapartism book. It also comes out in the Liberalism, a Counter History book. And it's also, I've only started the Class Struggles book, but it also, I can see already that it's going to be kind of integral to that. And so what I'm saying is that Losurdo is not going to give us a guide about how to pair Eastern Marxism and Western Marxism. He's not going to give us a road from Beijing to Detroit. But what he's asking us to do is to not take for granted the things that Western Marxism takes for granted, which is essentially the liberal bourgeois framework, but it's not the real. What Losurdo is saying is that the kind of liberalism that they're taking for granted isn't true historically, and it's also not true theoretically. So he's stress testing it against the actual history of its manifestation, but he's also stress testing it theoretically. and asking us to think about it dialectically. That's what this disemancipation emancipation thing is about. It's about the kind of contradictions that are inherent in liberalism. So that's that. I just wanted to say all that because I think it like everyone's comments, I think it gets at something fundamental, which is just I wanted to offer my particular way of reading Losurdo in this book and every other book that I've read by him. So I hope that's helpful.
And also the way that certain radical liberal ideals were also included within the expansion, say in 1917 in Russia, for the advancement of certain rights, which was way ahead of the West. And then here you have Western Marxists theorizing liberalism almost themselves as like too parochial to Europe, right? Like they're, you know what I mean? Like only the workers can defeat. So they make a false, and it's interesting, by the way, that Losurdo makes the point that Althusser got it from Stalin to associate liberalism as a class project of bourgeoisie. Losurdo seems to kind of be pushing away from that. This goes to his realism point, because in some sense, what 1789 unfurled on the world goes beyond just like bourgeoisie. Do you know what I mean? It's beyond that. That's the Hegelian point. You know, but that's a brilliant intervention. Thank you. Let's go to Akshay, and then we'll go to Chris, and then we'll probably close. I don't want to keep you guys forever.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess like I feel like the interesting direction Losurdo could go in the sense that it is bourgeoisies, but you know, sort of like bourgeoisie is connected to different sectors of exploitation, right? Like, and if we have like, I mean, kind of responding to what Connor was saying, like in the sense that from a vulgar and not even really that vulgar Marxist perspective, like we are in the most totalized capitalist market that has ever sort of existed, right? Like, so in terms of kind of this Luxembourg thesis of like an outside of, I mean, you know, in the sense that in 1910, you could still say that large parts of India were sort of pre-capitalist, but Indian agriculture today is by and large entirely capitalist, right? Like outside of, if you talk about some forms of like subsistence production that like do trade with the market. And I don't know, I mean, just the differences between 1917 and today, just like in sheer political economic terms, like so much of the Russian Revolution was based on the idea of a national socialism, which is, I mean, sorry, not the Nazis, but I mean, but this idea of also a national economy, right? Like, and I feel like, you know, that the big elephant in the room is sort of neoliberalism as a transformation of how the nation state itself is sort of organized. When we're thinking about transnational shipping, outsourcing, you know, I mean, these are sort of material shifts in the relationship between the state and finance, which have sort of disempowered the state in relation to finance, right? Like, which was a big kind of scandal with Syriza when they kind of came into power and kind of weren't able to execute what they said that they would. So, I mean, I don't know, like, again, like for instance, like when we're thinking of sort of China being in the situation of owning, like, I think some half of US debt, like, I think we're looking at a much more kind of ambiguously interconnected system, like where there remains a global South, right? But its contours are not as clear as I think as Losurdo sort of makes them out to be.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I myself disagree with the Marxist state theory of polansis, right? I'm much more Leninist personally. I think that the function of the state is the social reproduction and preservation of the exploitation of wage labor. And therefore, the Marxist definition of withering of the state is simply that which is concurrent to the abolition of wage labor, right? So it's a pretty tight formula in some sense. I'm more drawn to it as I read Lenin's theory of the states. Well, I mean, it's interesting because I have a comrade in Guinea, in West Africa, right, who's an Althusserian, trained like at the Sorbonne. Didn't train with Althusser, but he trained like in the generation after Althusser. And frankly, Althusserianism as an ism is too vast to reduce it. In my reading of it, it's too vast. It's the same way that you could not say that French Maoism is one thing, But again, I'm wanting us to read from the position of this kind of low res reading.
Uh-huh.
I think it's the only way to really tolerate this text is to read it as
Uh-huh.
a low res reading. Otherwise, you will get into an academic spider web of frustration, you know, like, oh, you forgot about this appropriator of Althusser who focused his whole life on colonial stuff, you know, which probably exists, like the comrade I just mentioned. Or even the fact that in the Congo, you have Wamba Diawamba, who is an Althusserian, yeah. Or in South Africa, you have the movement of the slum dwellers, which they're inspired by Althusser's ideas.
Yeah.
You know, they actually went to an HM conference and presented, and everyone gave him a standing ovation. So, yeah, I mean, look, I mean, it is what it is. Somebody needs to make this criticism. I think it's still, we didn't even talk about Sartre, by the way, because that's a big one with critique of dialectical reason, you know? And it is an anarchist pessimism. I'm sorry, but it is in all of this business of the failure of the fused group. It's basically Sartre's, it's a whole thing I've thought about a lot. I just think it kind of works like this. Like you read Losurdo's criticism, and it's going to be hard for us because we read all of these people, right? Way more than we read Losurdo, right? And so it becomes kind of like a passionate struggle, each person he takes on, you know. Just wait till we get to like Foucault, for example, right? Everybody has to read Foucault, yeah. But let's keep that low res focus and our tolerance high, and I think we'll be able to extract these rational kernels as we have been doing, you know. What his argument, though, is for Althusser is that he reformulates anti-humanism to respond to kind of like a parochial French context, maybe is one way to look at it. And I think that kind of is true. Like, I think that actually is somewhat true, you know? So much of Althusserianism is this like tit for tat with French Stalinism, you know? While he's in dialogue with these elite students, you know, and rethinking Marx's Capital. I don't know. Does Althusser completely neuter anti-colonial militancy? I don't think so, precisely because so many expositors of Althusser have utilized his work in colonial struggles, and we have examples of that, right? So yeah, but I mean, I don't want you to walk away thinking that like the theory of interpolation, right, is somehow excluding the colonial subject. That's not Althusser's intention. I don't even think that's what Losurdo is saying. What Losurdo is saying is that you gave up on radical humanism at a bad moment politically, right? When half the world was underutilizing this reservoir of radical thought, you went this way, right? That's an interesting point. That's the main nugget that I get out of that section. That's what I found useful, right? But it's not too dismissive of Althusser as such, you know.
Okay.
Anyways, you guys want to go break for now, and then we'll come back next week? Comrades, it's been a real honor to chat with y'all. I had a wonderful time. I hope y'all did too. Let's keep the momentum going. All the best. Peace out.